Good evening, everybody. My name is Laurel McDonald, and I'm the Associate Chief Librarian for Special Collections and the Director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. And on behalf of the U of T Libraries, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this exciting new series, this exciting new lecture series, which is called Beyond the Page, the J. Edward Chamberlin Lecture. So before we begin, I wish to invite Daniel Secord from the Mississauga First Nation, who will perform a ceremonial welcome for us. So over to you, Daniel.
Ani bonjour, ani kinawea, sinanene, Indigenous, Makwandonim, Mississauga and Dao, Anishinaabe and Dao. Miyama on Jabawan, Kidami kom Miyama, Megazi was Anunk, Minawa, Manda Enos win a king, Gichi Koajiking, Nagamwan, and Bogdana, Nungo Gijgat. So I'd like to say hello and welcome everybody. My name is Asina Nene or Daniel Secord. I'm from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, so our community is now located about I'd say almost 2 hours south of here. And that current land or name of that area and the waterway is near the Grand River now. So that is Peshiniganingash, Kwasing, and Zibi. So the lands that are adjacent to the Grand River, right? And that's where the waterway itself floods over. When it floods over, it clears the land. So either side of that waterway where it meets Zawazaikigan or Lake Erie, that's the name of the land. So many places here, we know it by many different names in the waterways as they come off of like the lakes and things, the river mouths and things. That a lot of the parts of the lands, they have names with that come from the waterways and things like that, how it radiates. So you may hear other Mississauga people. We have, like, my community have a different way of saying it, which talks about, more of the portaging through this area. And it's also connected to where you might hear about the carrying place, like going up towards the Swakama, towards Sudbury or Three Roads. But some of our other Mississauga communities, we refer to this as Chikwajike, which is, like where the actual land that you walk across in a portage. So our community generally talk about the actual portage, like the carrying of the canoes or the carrying places and stuff. And this area, we kind of refer to it as Megazi Wasanong, so a place of the bald eagle. So the greater, all the cities here around the GTA, the greater Toronto area, refer to it as Megazi Wasanong. So at the time of, we have a lot of Indigenous histories, so as I know it, I guess, when peace is made between the confederacies and things of Indigenous groups, the largest clan in this area was Bald Eagle, so that's why it's place of the Bald Eagle, like the general vicinity, and many places too, like the Don River and the Humber, the Credit River and things. They have names of those waterways and the lands and things and places in between. So Kabe, Shinonga, and Nong is the Don River, or the Humber River. Wasayashkute Niasing is the Don. Mizini Zibiing is to Credit River, Port Credit area, the Credit River and things like that. So I just want to share a little bit those things. That's what I was saying in the language. My name is Stoneman. I'm of the Bear Clan. I'm from Mississaugas of Credit. So introducing myself. I'm not doing a ceremony. I'm just going to sing a song to welcome everybody here and share a little bit. So thanks for listening, Miigwech, and thanks for the invitation. So on behalf of Mississaugas of Credit, we say welcome and thank you. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So, to begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the U of T operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to work on it. And we're certainly grateful to gather here this evening. So this evening, we'll be thinking more deeply about this land, especially the covenants between Indigenous peoples and animals and plants. This is all part of the inaugural lecture in this wonderful, remarkable new lecture series. Beyond the Page was established by the McLean Foundation in honor of Ted Chamberlin, who is a professor emeritus here at the U of T and a longtime advocate for Indigenous rights and Indigenous land claims, not only in Canada, but around the world. The purpose of this lecture series is really to engage Indigenous scholars, Indigenous artists, Indigenous memory keepers on topics that are at the top of the mind for Indigenous communities. Each year, this lecture will support conversation and connection with Indigenous communities and with Indigenous ways of knowing. We at the Fisher and at the U of T Library feel very, very privileged to host this lecture series. And we're incredibly honored that Ted and that the McLean Foundation chose to establish this new series here in the Fisher Library. So we're very grateful. And of course, we're also thrilled to have the inaugural lecturer, the terrific John Burroughs, speaking us tonight. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite the Chief Librarian, University Chief Librarian Larry Elford, to the front to say a few words. Larry?
Thank you, Laurel. And while I didn't get to meet you earlier, thank you, Daniel, as well. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for being here tonight, for joining us here in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library for the inaugural lecture, as Laurel said, of the new series, Beyond the Page, the J. Edward Chamberlin Lecture. The series is called Beyond the Page for a very particular reason. You know, our library community often speaks about ways to find stories beyond the pages of the book. They can often provoke more questions than answers. Questions like exactly how does one engage meaningfully with stories that have never been written down? Stories that have been passed down in oral traditions or even through song. Stories that have often been left out, in fact, intentionally omitted, outright omitted from our textbooks. So for the Indigenous peoples in Canada and all over the world, oral storytelling is at the heart of knowledge, learning, and tradition. I actually learned this in a very explicit way when I had the enormous privilege of visiting Iqaluit in June of 2023 on a study tour and met with a woman an Inuit woman who lived there, and we were talking actually about the Franklin and the Erebus, and I made the terrible mistake of referring to the Discovery, and she quickly let me know, quite rightly, that the Inuit people always knew where those two ships were, always. It's just that no one listened to them until finally somebody did. But through their storytelling tradition, there wasn't anything to be discovered because they knew exactly where they were and what happened. And while I had understood that before, I understood it in a very emotional way as she and I talked. So, as a library community, it's our responsibility to allow ourselves over the time and space to actively engage with these stories and those who tell them. These include the important Indigenous materials we have the privilege of stewarding here within the Fisher Library's own collections, many of which tell their own stories. Starting tonight, I believe, I'm convinced the Beyond the Page series represents a significant step forward in our efforts to understand and listen to the ideas rooted in Indigenous stories and traditions. It will foster meaningful connections with the scholars, knowledge keepers, and creators who share these invaluable narratives, and starting with tonight's speaker, Professor John Burroughs. He is a University of Toronto law professor and a member of the Chippewa of the Nawash First Nation. He is the Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law. Among his many accolades, he is the 2017 Killam Prize winner in Social Sciences, the 2019 Molson Prize winner from the Canadian Council for the Arts, the 2020 Governors General Innovation Award, and the 2021 Canadian Bar Association's President's Award winner. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2020, and he is renowned as an extraordinary storyteller, and we're deeply, deeply honored to have him here for this inaugural lecture. In tonight's lecture, Professor Burroughs will tell us the story of how First Nations community forged agreements with the plants and animals in order to live in harmony on this land. He will also tell us what these more than human treaties can teach us today. His lecture topic is emblematic of the spirit in which this series was created. And for that, the creation of that, I want to acknowledge Ted Chamberlin, who traveled from Victoria to join us here tonight with his wife, Lorna Goodison. We're delighted to have both of them here. This lecture series was generously established in Ted's name by the McLean Foundation for his decades of service on their board of directors. So I understand that Ted had many options for endowing these funds, and it was not a decision he made lightly. He spent a lot of time carefully contemplating this choice. And we're delighted on the choice that he made and deeply grateful to the McLean Foundation as well. Ultimately, in thinking about doing this series, Ted followed his heart, first in regards to the subject matter of this series, which I know is very dear to him, given his many, many years of work supporting Indigenous land claims all over the world. And he also chose to bring this lecture idea back home to us, back here to the U of T, where he taught and inspired students for so many years, and back to the Fisher Library. So Ted, your trust and confidence in the Fisher is very meaningful to all of us here, and we are so grateful to you and to the McLean Foundation for making this lecture series possible. We know we bear a unique responsibility towards Indigenous communities and to those materials that are housed in our collections. Through mindful cataloging, workshops, and now the Chamberlin Lecture, we continue to approach this work with intentionality and great care. So now we have the opportunity to move the notion of a traditional lecture series beyond the page and into the realms of something new and something quite wonderful. So I think we're about to experience some of that wonder tonight right here with Professor Burroughs. I once again want to thank Ted, Lorna, the McLean Foundation for making this lecture possible, and I will now turn it over to Professor Burroughs.
Bushu, Nadini Makanaruk, Niji Nishnabeg, Nij Marazig, Bangi Tago Ninata Nishnabem, Ingaguditu Nishtamayan, Giganos, Ndishnakas, Nayashi, Winninging and Donjaba, Nagigin Dodam, Miquech Biajag Nungum. It's a delight to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. It's so nice to be with Laurel again, who we were at UBC many years ago when she was going through law school, and I was a new teacher at that time. Thank you for that warm welcome and for the beautiful song. I really appreciate the spirit that was in the language and that was in that song as well. I'm also really grateful to be here with Ted and to enjoy this opportunity to reflect on the endowment that's occurred here that will allow us to continue to understand more about Indigenous storytelling and the relationships that we have with one another and with the land. It's been a while since I've known Ted. I knew him from a distance, but I knew him through his books. And those books spoke to me very strongly because I also wanted to not just write like a conventional law professor. I wanted to find ways that were more evocative, were more able to understand that covenant of wonder that he talks about in his writings. And I hope this evening that with discussing treaties, that we'll be discussing the covenant of wonder that we have with the more than human world. Ted, in his work with land claims, with the Berger Mackenzie inquiry was so formative, and the people that he's worked with through the years have really built the strong foundation on which many of us stand. And so I'm appreciative of being able to be here and bring honor and appreciation to what Ted has done. I introduced myself, Nigigin Dodem. I'm of the Otter clan. And so this is the family that I'm a part of at Cape Croker, and in fact across what we call Anishinaabe a King. Anishinaabe people live in what is now Quebec and Ontario, Manitoba over into Saskatchewan. There's even a couple of communities in Alberta, one in northern BC. And we're also in Montana, Dakota, and then a number of communities in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And so wherever I travel across that territory and I encounter another otter, I'm with family. And we have these responsibilities and mutual obligations to one another to share our appreciation and also to share the obligations that are there with each other. So Nigigin Dodem is how I introduced myself. Neashi Winnigaming and Don Jaba. So I'm from the Saugeen Anishinaabe people here on what is now the Saugeen or the Bruce Peninsula. And I'm from the Cape Croker Indian Reserve on this side, Neashi Winnigaming. And we're connected quite closely to our cousins, our people there at Southampton. And you can see the rivers that run into this territory, and this is something that gives my life meaning. I introduced myself as Giganos Indigenous. Giganos means speaker. It's the name that was my third great-grandfather's name, and it was the name that was given to me when I was a younger person because my mother encouraged me to be a speaker. And the image that you see here is a person named Tecumseh. Tecumose is to walk across. And Tecumseh was married to Wasega Boa, who is Giganos's sister. And so we fell in with these Shawnee people to try to develop relationships up and down the eastern seaboard as we were encountering people coming from other parts of the world. And with Tecumseh and Wasega-Boa and Giganos, my ancestor, we tried to bring people together in alliance to deal with the challenges that we faced. As a part of that time, Giganos heard about what was happening at the River Credit here in our backyard here, and he visited, and we have his speeches. He says, brothers, when I was in my own country, I heard what the Great Spirit had done in your country. And I come to see how the Great Spirit has here planted a tree whose branches reach up to the skies. And he said, I desire that my children will also be able to climb that tree. And so he was making a point that he was understanding that there was new relationships that were being formed with the Methodists that were in the area. And he wanted to learn how to read, and he wanted his children to learn how to read. And he also wanted to understand this tradition of Christianity from an Anishinaabe legal perspective. And so he came and he learned and he appreciated, and then he was actually baptized in the Grand River in about maybe 8 or 9, somewhere around that area. And so our connections to this city before it became a city go back quite strongly because of the way that our people would associate with one another across these vast distances. And what he was doing, he was entering into a covenant of wonder, not only with the settlers that were coming into the territory, but also with his brothers and sisters who were fellow Anishinaabe in the territory as well. And through people like Tecumseh, war was a part of this to ensure that there was a land preserved for the Anishinaabe, but it was more than just war. It was also about peace. It was trying to find ways of reconciling different points of view, and it was also ways of welcoming others into the territory, which Giganos did, which Peter Jones did, who was the person that he went to visit in that area. And so when I was a law student back in 1992 here doing my LLM, I wrote a genealogy of law. And I talked about these 7 generations of our relationships to this territory. This is the next generation. This person over here is my great-great-grandfather. He took upon himself the name Giganos again. He was given that name, Giganos. But he was called Peter Giganos Jones because the person that baptized his father and baptized him was this Peter Jones, a Methodist missionary. And Peter was in this city in 1837 because he was going to school around Beaverton. And he marched down Yonge Street to Eglinton as a part of the Mackenzie Rebellion. He did not want the establishment, as it were, to be so tight with the way that they were dealing with Indigenous peoples in this area, and so he chose that rebel side, and that formed relationships for him that took him through the rest of his life. You can see here that he's got a couple of medals around his neck. That's because he entered into a treaty in our territory dealing with 1.4 million acres of land between Arthur and Goderich and Collingwood and north of that area, welcoming people to come into our territory to live in accordance with the laws that we had learned from the more than human world. And the one way he expressed that was he put his otter Dodim on the parchment of the treaty, indicating that that's our responsibility to live in relationship to those animals and the other animals that are there on that parchment. And again, we were hoping, we were inviting others to live in accordance with that agreement. There's another medal around his neck here because when the treaty was being implemented, there was a need to survey the lands to ensure that people could share in the way that we hoped they would. And as they were surveying, one of those surveyors got quite ill and was really sick. And so Peter loaded this surveyor up at Markdale, Ontario, so a couple of hours north here by car, and he dragged that surveyor on a sleigh from what is Markdale down here to Toronto so that that person would receive the aid and the help necessary to ensure that they would recover, that they would do well in the world. And so as a result of that, he received a second medal, this time from Queen Victoria, for that effort. The point is that when we signed treaties, we wanted to extend that hospitality to live in accordance with our laws in the more than human world. And there was also action that was taken as a part of that by ensuring that people were taken care of when they lived in our territory. And so that's Peter Giganos Jones over on that side and his connections with this land through coming down Yonge Street, through helping people be rescued. Over here is a book called Tales of Nokomis. And this book was written by Verna Patronella Johnson in the 1970s. She was big in the Indian Friendship Center movement here. And she tells these stories about our relationship with the more than human world, how the skunk got its stripes and how the jewelweed got its powers and how the corn came to be amongst us. And in other words, in telling these stories, she was telling us about our laws, our relationships with the more than human world. And within those stories are standards, principles, criteria, authorities, signposts, guideposts, measures, indicia for regulating our affairs and resolving our disputes, because we regard the more than human world as our teachers. They are our professors. They are the ones that we look to understand how we should be living in this place. And so what this book does is it sees the earth as the library. It sees the archive of learning in the animals, in the trees, in the waters, and others that are around us. And when Verna wrote this book, she said that she heard these stories from her great-grandmother, and that those stories were told to her great-grandmother by her great-great-grandmothers. And there's this picture there of this woman, Margaret MacLeod, who is the person that really pass these stories along. And part of having treaty relationships is ensuring that this train of transmission continues so that we're aware of our responsibilities with regard to the more than human world. Margaret here was also a linguist, speaking English, Anishinaabe, and French, and she was also a medicine woman. Her name is Mashkikikwe, and so she knew about how to help others, as Peter did, because of her knowledge of the plants. Our word for plant or medicine is mashkiki. Ki is the way, or ki is the word for earth. Mush is the word for strength. Mashkiki is the strength of the earth. That's what plants are. Mashkiki, the strength of the earth. That's what medicine is. We take that strength of the earth inside ourselves and we flourish when that's used properly. And so there was a lot of teachings about understanding our treaty relationships through Verna, who just was up the road here at Spadina, and through the ways that these were passed down through these generations. This is my great-grandfather, Charles Giganos Jones. He lived to be 100, and when he was 100, he came in from the forest with a deer over his neck. Very strong person and was able to shoot and prepare a deer at that age. He was a farmer his life. He was also a plasterer. He went to the residential school over at the credit area. In fact, he married Amelia Chichok. And Amelia Chichok is the granddaughter of the person that signed the treaty in this area. And so, our family gets connected through marriage to the people in this area and the treaties in this area through that Chichok understanding. Charles here was also a runner, and so he could run from Cape Croker to Toronto in about 8 days. And he could run from Toronto to what is now Detroit in about 8 days, and he could do a little bit longer to get up to Ottawa. And he was able to do that because he knew about the more than human world and what was necessary to sustain himself as he went across those pathways, because of course he had learned that from his mother. And this running function, this giganos function, giganos means speaker. And it's actually gigado is the word speaker, gigadons is the diminutive. And what the responsibilities of all of these people, Giganos, Peter Giganos Jones, Charles Giganos Jones, is whenever there's a council that's called, you would be called upon to remember what was said in that council. And if there was need to clarify or understand in a future council, this person would stand up and help to remember what those stories were in regard to how their agreements came together. And so it's the name I carry now, but it's the name that illustrates the responsibilities that we have in treaties, which is to remember what's been said and to pass along what's been said and to remember how it's being said and in relationship to the more than human world. He was the most loving figure in my mother's life as she was growing up. He was a tremendous support to her. This is my grandfather, Josh Jones, with my sister, Jennifer, outside the old cabin at Cape Croker. And Josh went to day school on the reserve and was abused. And that really caused him a lot of turmoil and challenge. And so he became another kind of runner. He ran away from the reserve because of what he was experiencing there. And he kept running and he became settled for a little while at Walpole Island in the Detroit area, and he became a rum runner at that point during the Temperance era, sending things back and forth across the border. But he kept going. He went down to Kentucky and he helped an academic learn about plants and received an honorary doctorate, though he never himself got beyond the day school on the reserve. And he eventually kept running and he went to Hollywood and he became a Hollywood Indian. And so during the transition from the silent films to the talking films, he was in a union called the First Americans. And he would get paid for being shot at and falling off horses. Right? So in other words, he's trying to escape all of these challenges and stereotypes, and he's running to places where that keeps getting replicated for him. Eventually, he's living in California when Pearl Harbor is bombed. And so people that looked like him didn't feel safe in that area. And so he loaded up his family, Grapes of Wrath style, and came across the continent back to the reserve and lived on the reserve for the rest of his life. When I was a young boy, he lived up on our hunting reserves near what is now the Bruce Peninsula National Park. And he did that for about 7 or 8 years. He could live off the land, and he would only come in from town about every 6, or from the forest about every 6 weeks just to get some tea. And then he would go back out into the land. And for a while, he lived in Toronto. My mother loves this song by Gordon Lightfoot, "The Old Man Came In From the Forest." This is the sense that she has of thinking about her father in that way. And for a time, some of his children lived in the city and were homeless here in the city. And so the ties continue in that way. Here is the next generations. My mother ran away from the reserve when she was 14 as well, because all of her siblings were being taken off to residential schools, and she did not want to go to residential school, and so she ended up in Wyerton, and then in Hanover, and eventually in Brampton, when Brampton was about 5,000 people, and she made her way in the world as a young woman, trying to escape some of those challenges that were there through that residential school experience. Of course, I come into her arms as a young boy, and I'm born over here at the Toronto General Hospital, just not so far away, continuing the opportunity to have covenants of wonder in the city. As you see, there's a train of transmission across these generations. It's important to note that our people are intermarrying, meeting people from other parts of the world, falling in love with people from other parts of the world, and making them a part of our family as well. And so there's Charles with his second wife, Ella. Amelia Chichak passed away when their third child was being born. And so Ella kind of came into that family, and they had 7 more children together. And then over here, my grandma, Una, was born in Salt Lake City, and then she was a seamstress for Universal Studios as Josh was working on in the movies. And then here's my mother and my father. My father came from Yorkshire. He was a young man, about 9 years old, living near Sheffield when Sheffield was being bombed during the war, and he knew he couldn't stay. He was traumatized by that, walking home every day, seeing people's limbs and bodies in the street. He was drafted to work in the RAF at the end of the war, so he didn't have to do active service. But as soon as his time with the RAF came to an end, he found his way to Canada. It wasn't long before they met. And so the point I'm making here, that Anishinaabe people are a multi-ethnic people, where it's not just about blood, it's not just about race, it's not just about ethnicity, it's also about family and kinship and how we make community with people coming from different parts of the world. Here's my daughter, Agigata. She's a jingle dress dancer. She danced in the powwows here in this area. She went to the University of Toronto's law school for her first year of university law school, and then she's now teaching at Queen's Law School. And so the tradition of teaching about treaties continues, and we do classes about Anishinaabe law in the city here, and we do classes regarding Anishinaabe law up at Cape Croker and Rama and other places. And it's wonderful to think about this train of transmission with regard to treaties in that way. Another daughter here in this side, her name is Megan, or Chigatase. That's the word for chickadee in Anishinaabemowin. And she has autism. And she's an incredible teacher of treaties because she can walk into rooms and know what's out of place, what's out of order, because of her superpowers as an autistic person. And because she knows patterns so well, and when things are out of order, if there's vulnerabilities, she can call out those vulnerabilities and bring that to others' attention, which is quite an important skill in the world. It's interesting that her name is Chickadee in Anishinaabe, Chick-chick-chigadase. We have another word for this bird, and it is related to how it sings out. In the wintertime, when there's the deep snows and these birds are freezing and seeking out shelter in the boughs of the cedar trees, they will call out to one another, "She may, she may, she may," which means they're looking out for their little brothers and sisters. That's literally what the word she may means, little brother and sister. And that's what they do, is they call out. And our daycare at Cape Croker at Neashiwingaming, emblazoned across the front of the building is Nishime, to ensure that we care for those that are coming along. And so 2 law professors of different types here, understanding their responsibilities and living into them. And then a next generation comes along. Over here is Wasea, which means shining bright and clear. That's a family name, Waseance, which is that Margaret MacLeod's sister. And so the name continues there. And over here is Akika. Aki means earth, Ka is the fullness of the earth. And so she's teaching us about having that joy in that fullness. And then finally, about 6 months ago, we had Noka enter our family. Noka means spirit bear. He was born in February, which is the bear cub moon. And so when everything is silent and quiet, and there's again the thick snow on the ground, what's happening is the bears are giving birth to these little ones, and those little ones come out and they find their mother's breasts, and they're nourished in the bosom of the earth underneath the snow. That is when things look bleak, when they look cold, when it looks as if there's no life that's going to ever happen on the earth, you can be rest assured that that life is generating under the snow. And sometimes in that time, you'll have mists that will rise across the land as the cold and the warm air intermingle with one another. We'll often say that's the afterbirth, reminding us of these little ones being born into the world. And so here's Noka now with us, and you can see one of Lindsay's colleagues made a beautiful moss bag here and gave her about 100-page, almost PhD dissertation about what all is present on that moss bag. So what I'm trying to communicate here is that there's a relationship to this place through generations that is formed through our relationships with religion and spirituality, that's formed through our relationships with treaties, that's formed through our relationships with stories, that's formed through our relationships with the traveling back and forth, that's formed through the challenges that we have in trying to overcome some of the abuses that we received. And there's so much that we can look to find about the treaties in this way. This is Tattle Creek. Over here, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, was a gathering place for Seneca people, Haudenosaunee people, Wendat people, and Anishinaabe people. And we would gather at these streams in seasonal rounds to nourish ourselves with the fish that were coming up through the territory, to nourish ourselves with the kinds of songs that were sung as we would gather and celebrate the returning of the fish. And of course, we would find ourselves at home in these places. And as you know, this has eventually been covered up. But the point that I'm hoping to make from this is that we have these stories here that are beyond the pages of the book that continue to sound out, even though they're running through culverts and grates and they're underneath us. The way that we sustained ourselves for thousands of years has not disappeared. And Basil Johnson talks about this in the context of this notion called a kinomage. Again, a ki is the earth, nomage is to point towards and take direction from the earth. I'm not sure I can quite read this, but he says, learning comes not only from the earth, from books, but from the earth and its surroundings as well. Indeed, learning comes from the mountains, valleys, forests, meadows, and these things anteceded book knowledge. What we know about law, life and living, good and evil, laws and the purposes of insects, birds, animals, and fish comes from the earth, the weather, the seasons, the plants, and the other beings. He says the earth is our book, the days its pages, the seasons paragraphs, the years chapters. The earth is a book, alive with events that occur over and over for our benefit. Mother Earth has formed our beliefs, attitudes, insights, and outlooks, values, and institutions. So this is this notion of ikinomagewin, or trying to learn about our legal responsibilities by learning to read this book that's flowing under us, that's all around us. For Anishinaabe people, we find this in our creation story as we gathered on the back of a turtle and asked the animals to dive deep to bring up some sustenance from the soil below the water. And in telling these stories about these beings, we learned that law is present in the way groups, including animals and plants, solve problems, resolve conflicts, make collective decisions, create safety, maintain or repair relationships, and act on their responsibilities to each other. I wish I could tell you this story. It would take about half an hour to tell it, but maybe you've heard of Turtle Island and being created on the back of the turtle. And the point here is that these animals problem solved with one another in council, hearing different points of view about how they might be able to bring the water up from the bring the earth up from under the water below, and how the littlest one, the muskrat, gave their life in the bringing up of that water, of that earth from the water below. There's a whole set of constitutional principles in that creation story that is how we are constituted in this part of the world. We also have stories about treaties. So I consider that our creation story a treaty. That is, how do the animals coordinate with one another to problem solve, to bring up something that wasn't already available to us. And then we have other stories that talk about how at one time there was an abundance of all of these people of the Hoof Nation that were among us, and that eventually we noticed that they weren't present anymore, the deer and the moose and the caribou. And we formed a council to figure out, has anyone seen them? Where have they gone? And emissaries were sent in the different directions towards the Abenaki, Wabanong, down the St. Lawrence, to the east, and then to the south, the Shawan, the Shawnee people, and then to the west amongst the Cree and Kickapoo and Odawa and Potawatomi and others, in Nigabianung towards the west, and then to the north, Giwadanung. And we went north, we actually found that all of those animals were there in the northern direction. They were not in these other regions. And we suspected that they were there prisoners of the Crows. And so we didn't take our time to ask, we just assumed, and then we rushed into battle trying to rescue these of the Hoof Nation from their forced captivity, as we thought it was with the Crows. When there was a truce called in the midst of the battle, the chief of the Anishinaabe walked over to the chief of the Deer and said, "Here we are fighting, spilling our blood on the soil to try to rescue you, try to get you out of your forced confinement, and you are standing there doing nothing. Why are you so apathetic? Why are you not taking action to liberate yourself in that way?" And then the Deer looks back to the Anishinaabe and says, "Oh, you're mistaken if you assume that we are here against our wishes. These Crows have treated us better than you ever did when we lived in your country." And so then the sort of response back by the Anishinaabe to the Deer is, "Well, what did we do?" And the Deer said, "Well, you have wasted our flesh, you've broken our bones, you've taken our children before their time, you have not left something in reciprocity when you're taking us." And the Anishinaabe reflected and felt the truth of that. And so they asked what they could do. And the Deer said, "Well, cease wasting our flesh, cease breaking our bones, preserve our forests and our homelands, preserve our children. And if something is going to be taken of our flesh, leave something in return so that we can have this relationship. And the Anishinaabe agreed with those promises, and so the deer come back to live amongst us. This notion that our first treaties are with the more than human world that then get put into our treaties with one another between Anishinaabe and others is a part of this work. We've done this work in so many ways. When there was treaties being negotiated in Niagara at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the Beaver War, the French were defeated on the Plains of Abraham by the British. But at that moment, what happened is most of the forts that were purportedly now British fell into Indigenous hands. And you have Indian leaders, Anishinaabe leaders like Miniweiwei saying, Englishmen, you've conquered the French, but you've not conquered us. These fields and these forests and these mountains are ours, and we will part with them to none. You have a choice. You can pick up the musket, we'll pick up the tomahawk, and we'll continue our ways of war. Or you can pick up the pipe of peace, and we will enter into agreements of peace and friendship and respect. And so there was a choice as to what would happen in British North America after those Plains of Abraham moments. And what occurred is the British promulgated the Royal Proclamation, which says that Indians are nations and tribes with whom we're connected, and we will not molest them, and we will not disturb them, and all their lands will be reserved to them. And if there is going to be a transfer of lands to the British, that has to be in a public meeting called for that purpose. And it can't be with the local settler colonial governments. It has to be with the more distant imperial governments, because they're worried about those that are just adjacent molesting and disturbing. They'll have the greater incentive to take that which is right next door. And so the Royal Proclamation is promulgated, but in some ways, for Anishinaabe people, that's really not worth the paper it's written on. That's not our way of communicating with one another. And so what happened is Sir William Johnson, the head official in the Northern Superintendency of Indian Affairs, sent out wampum strings to the Anishinaabe and other people, Haudenosaunee, other people living around the Great Lakes, inviting them to a meeting the following season in 1764. And said that there will be peace, that there will be treaties, that there will be presence, that we'll be able to make our way together with one another. And as the Anishinaabe were receiving this, they thought, should we do this? We might be walking into a trap. We're not sure if this is a good idea. And so they go into their shake tents, which is a place where you communicate with the turtle spirit. And in that communication, they receive knowledge that it's going to be okay to travel to Niagara. They will be received well. They will receive presents. So in other words, before we made treaties with the British, we talked with the turtle. We talked with ourselves amongst those clans, and that's a part of our creation story, as I mentioned a few moments ago as well. Well, on the way, as the parties came from the north shore of Lake Huron down the eastern shores of Georgian Bay, they camped for the evening when it was getting very windy, and they discovered a 5-foot-long rattlesnake. And it was going to be the case that the English trader with them, Alexander Henry, wanted to kill that snake. And the Anishinaabe were not happy with that, and so they all surrounded the snake, and they made a pipe ceremony. And so they blew smoke towards the grandfather as they addressed this snake, and they asked for forgiveness for what was being intended by their traveling companion, and they asked for advice about what they should do as they go down to Niagara. And unlike the turtle, the snake has another message. Be careful, be cautious, turn back. So these different ways of understanding the more than human world are now engaged as the people head down to to Niagara. And what happens in 1764 is that there's meetings, including from the Anishinaabe people of the Credit here and my people up in the Cape Croker area, and over 2 months they exchange 84 wampum belts. And they feast one another and they give lots of presents. And what they do with these wampum belts is they use Anishinaabe protocols of diplomacy. And so I have here the 2-row wampum. You can see it's replicated on that side. And you may know that these originally were made out of shells. The purple shells are quahog shells, and the white shells are whelk shells. And these beings, these more than humans, live in liminal spaces on the east coast of this continent. And the quahog will travel quite a great distance along the surface of the shore over a day, maybe the size of this room. And the whelk will bury itself deep in the sands. And the quahog will be, that's the purple one, will be searching for the white one, deep buried in the sands. That whelk is what's called dangerous prey, because as the quahog tries to take it, the whelk will strike back and sometimes cause damage to the shell of the quahog. And what's happened over millennia is that these creatures have developed hardened shells and different behaviors in relationship to their environment because of that need for reciprocity in that area. And so what we have with these wampum belts is we have the more than human world and what happens with conflict, and we're weaving the thoughts of humans into the thoughts of the more than human world to give us some guidance about how we might live together in peace and friendship and respect on our rivers of life. And, you know, the Crown and its ship of state controlling its affairs, and the Anishinaabe on their river of life and their canoe controlling their affairs. And this, I think, is quite significant, that it's reminding us that our laws come from the waters. It's reminding us that we learn about how we should live with one another, given what we've learned from those shells along that shore. And as speeches are given over that 2-month period, there's continued reference to the more than human elements that surround us. There's a metal that's exchanged as a part of this, and the Crown talks about that these treaties will be for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. Again, bringing out the sensibilities that the more than human world can help us understand our treaties. You see the little totems here again of the treaty here in this area, this Chichok, which was the great, which was the grandfather of a former member of our community. And then you get these treaties that are signed in these settings throughout the Mississauga territory. What I want to just conclude with in about 7 minutes is to try to understand how we can create a relationship with treaties by just turning to the more than human world around us. There's this beautiful new installation on the other side of Hart House now called Zeebing, and it's where Tattle Creek used to run. And so it's trying to bring out once more what we were learning in that space. And so you can see there's a turtle here. And under that turtle, we're reminded of our creation story and the animals working together in a treaty-like way to covenant with one another, to help one another. And if you stand under that turtle, you'll see the constellations that are there engraved. And there's a fire pit in this place. There's teaching spaces over here, and there's native plants that are all in these gardens, and you can read the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee word and Anishinaabe words for those plants. And there's markers at the 4 directions, and eventually there'll be a QR code that will be affixed onto some of those directions so that you can learn, pull up on your phone some of the teachings that might appear as a part of this area. In other words, the University of Toronto, through their Truth and Reconciliation policy, is trying to find ways to bring out those teachings again. Every morning I live at Massey College here, and I run to Casa Loma and back, and I encounter a lot of these little critters along the way. And I can remember Basil Johnson teaching me. Basil Johnson lived on my reserve. He wrote 25 books, 18 in English, the rest in Anishinaabe. And he would say, when you can look outside and see the squirrel and realize that you are no more or no less than each other in the eyes of the Creator, then you are practicing Daba Bain Dizuin, or you're practicing humility, or you're practicing our treaty 7 grandmother, 7 grandfather teachings. And so every morning when I'm running, I see skunks, and I see squirrels, and I hear blue jays, and I hear cardinals, and I know stories about them, robins. In other words, for me, they're like flying common law cases, because in the stories, like my great-great-grandmother taught me, are all these principles, standards, criteria, authority, signposts, guideposts, measures for regulating affairs and resolving our disputes. And they are still with us, and they still teach us through the language, through the stories, etc. So I appreciate being able to live treaties, run with treaties, understand what these teachers are trying to give me as I'm out in the morning. We had this beautiful old carcass, this old oak tree standing outside the law school that was taken down this past winter. And look what happened when that was taken down. The next morning, this fox shows up and stands over that trunk, wondering, watching. Obviously, there is a change in the environment, and if you're familiar with this area, which I'm sure you are, you know that foxes are here and coyotes are here, and we see the bald eagles over the Queen's Park, and I see the osprey over Queen's Park, and I see the red-tailed hawk over Queen's Park. All of these voices, all of these presents are still there, teaching us about who we might be, what our responsibilities are in these spaces. And this is the points that I'll conclude with in about 3 minutes here. So what we've got is Micha Zaga, right? Micha means big, Zaga means the river mouth. We've got here Zagin. Our word for love in Anishinaabe is the Gidawin. And Basil Johnson often taught me that if you want to learn how to love, you learn that from a river. What a river does is it collects nutrients from all over its watershed, and, first with like little small upwellings or little pools from rain falling down that become rivulets, and those rivulets eventually form into little creeks, and the creeks form into streams, and the streams eventually join one another until you get Micha Zaga. You get an outpouring here, and at those river mouths, that's the most vibrant, life-enhancing place of all the territory, because you're delivering all these nutrients to this spot, and with that, you get the microbial life gathering, where you then get an abundance of the insects and the fish and the birds and the animals, and of course then Anishinaabe will come along also to partake of that. So what Basil said is love is delivering in defined channels the conditions that create a great variety and sustainability of life, right? Love is about trying to ensure that life is there in all its abundance. And so he used that word in thinking about our treaties, love. And you can see all of these rivers running into Lake Ontario in this area. So that's Zagin, love. Learn from the river, or as long as the river flows, we can learn about our treaties because they teach us about love. This is right outside the pages. Here, out front in the spring, Zagi Baga. We're being taught about love once again, because what are these petals doing? They're opening themselves up to the sun, to receive pollinators, to receive the sun, to be able to then send energy back down to the roots for as long as the grass grows. But for as long as we're taught about love, how do we as human beings open ourselves up to all these different influences, this covenant of wonder that we're in this university, to receive these ideas, to ensure that there's this replication of life? and to see that that's, for as long as the grass grows, we have this ability to learn about treaties in that way. And then Zagate. Zagate means the sun that's shining down on your face. Of course, the sun is a source of life as well. But you're seeing in all these words, Zagate, Zagibaga, Zagin, you're seeing reference to love. And there's teachings. What is love in the context of the sun? The warmth, the light, the ability to be able to see more clearly. That's what we should be doing with one another. When the British came to sign treaty with us, they said, see that sun? Look at those red coats. You'll always know that we're here to support you because you'll see that, like the sun, we will provide. So that's basically these treaty teachings. They're written in the earth around us, and they're written in the intergenerational transmission of stories through our families and through our relationships. And if we can find those ways to read them in fires, in leaves, in rivers, in squirrels, in plants, in the skunks, everything that surrounds us will give us an opportunity to learn how we should live with peace and friendship and respect. So, miigwech bizindig mi iu ahau. Thank you for this time together.
So much, Sean. That was really beautiful. It really was. And I think it's something incredibly inspiring, and it was such a tonic, I think, as well. So thank you so much. So if you don't mind, we do have a few minutes for some questions. Does anybody have a question?
Yes.
I'd like to know if you have any idea where those gold medallions are.
Yes, those. I was once fortunate to do something with the archives in Ottawa, where we brought out copies of the treaties to have a curated display, and we were also able to bring some of those medallions out as a part of that. So some of them are in private collections, but some of them are in public trust, and from time to time they're being displayed. Yeah.
Any other questions? I see Ted and Lorna. Did you, any other questions? I see Ted, you look like you're paused. You wish to say something, but not to put you on the spot.
Well, what I can say on the spot is thank you. Thank you, John. You and I have been together lots, and I've learned from you every time. And as you've learned from people that I had the honor to know as well, Basil Johnson and the other members of your community, it's with enormous gratitude that I thank you for coming, and thank you for speaking, and thanking you for showing us a way, showing us a number of ways. And showing us how to believe in them, which is right at the heart of it all. Thank you.
Thank you. Miigwech.
So I think that concludes our evening. I just have a couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, this is the last Friends of the Fisher lecture for the UTL Director of Advancement, Michael Casaubon. Michael will be leaving us to join the De Groot School of Business at McMaster, I believe at the end of November. So thank you, Michael, for all that you've done on our behalf. We're very grateful. And I also wanted to thank Daniel for his lovely singing and performance. We very much appreciate that. And of course, John for giving a remarkable lecture. We're very grateful for that as well. So thank you both. And I also very much wish to thank the McLean Foundation for their generous endowment and for bringing this lecture here to the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. We're incredibly indebted and grateful to the foundation as well, so thank you. And last but not least, Ted, we're very grateful to you. As Larry was saying, your trust and your confidence in the U of T libraries to manage and curate and steward this lecture series moving forward means everything to us. We're incredibly grateful. I know that you have a very special relationship with the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, and in particular with its past director, Richard Landon. And I think that Richard would have been very pleased and very proud to see this wonderful initiative that you and the McLean Foundation have brought here to the Fisher. So we're incredibly grateful. And I very much assure you that we will do our best to be diligent stewards of this lecture series. And in turn, we will benefit, and we've already benefited this evening from this amazing opportunity to engage and to connect with Indigenous communities and Indigenous ways of knowing. And this evening's the start, and it's a remarkable start. But we know this will continue for many years to come, so we're incredibly grateful to you. So thank you, Ted. And with that, I will thank all of you for joining us this evening. Feel free to mingle. And I ask that Larry and Ted and John come to the front for photographs. So thank you all and have a lovely evening.